and welcome to the lecture series on basic cognitive processes. I am Dr. Ark Verma from IIT Kanpur. Today we'll be talking on a topic which is slightly philosophical, slightly actually, it should help you think about perception in a slightly broad way. Okay, we are going to talk about the concept of representation in perception. Now, I want you to think of perception and I want you to think of what really perception means. If you actually put some thought to this, what does perception really involve? Now, perception basically is is representing the information that is in the outside world to your mind, isn't it? Cognitive psychology is all about mind. What we're trying to do is to represent everything that is external to us to an internal world, which is your mind space. How do we do it? We do it with the help of various senses, be it vision, be it audition, be it through your nose, which is olfaction, be it through your taste buds, which is gustatory, or through your skin, which is tactile information. What is it that you're actually and basically doing in perception? What you're doing is you're representing the world outside to the world inside. Okay, that is just a very quick concept about what representation is. Now, representation in itself has a few, a few thorny issues. They have really been, investigated or talked about, let us say, more deeply in philosophy. They have also concerned cognitive scientists and psychologists and people who study visual perception or auditory perception or any kind of perception for that matter. We'll try in today's lecture to really, go into and have a feel of this problem, and maybe this will help you understand whatever is going to come later in the topic of perception. It is kind of trying to, create a baseline for you to understand what perception is all about. Now, representation is basically can also be said to be the currency of cognition. Your mind cannot work on external information unless it is represented in a language that the mind understands. What is this representation? What could be the first step of this representation? We have been talking about this since some time now, starting from psychophysics till the physiology class, that this basic conversion process is what is called transduction, isn't it? What does transduction actually do? How do you really make sense of information that is outside? It's like imagining somebody who goes to a foreign country and he's just carrying the currency of his home country. Say, for example, you travel to Europe, but you only have rupees, and you want to spend those rupees to buy goods. But will those rupees be accepted? Will people, let you use rupees to buy, whatever eatables or place to stay or whatever? So this is basically what the problem of representation is about. You need to convert the currency that is of the external world to the currency that is of the internal mind space, and this process of conversion of this currency is what now an important, so this is basically what we have to talk about. So an important concept of all cognition, or more precisely this whole point of input to the functional architecture of the mind, is representation. To try and define it technically, a mental representation is anything that allows us to think, to visualize, and to make judgments concerning these physical objects or scenes in their absence. Say, for example, in this, at this moment while giving this lecture, I want to think about my home. Okay, I want to think about, let us say, my study desk in my drawing room. How can I do it at this moment? I do not have them right in front of me, so I cannot really see them, but I do have what is called a representation of that in my head. I have seen that once, I have stored it in my memory, but how do I store something in my memory? So it needs to be converted to a language, to a file kind, if for example you want to follow the computer metaphor, the file needs to be converted to a type that my brain can store. That is the problem of representation. So it is really important to, it's also important to refer to the function of this mental representation, where why do we create these mental representations? As I said, if I have to talk about my drawing room and my study table, I have to have, I'm using that representation for something. That mental representation is being used for me, by me to talk about that. So the concept of this mental representation and why is this mental representation needed is also something which we need to understand. So one of the very basic concepts is, say for example, to recognize. You have to have a mental representation of something that is in the external world to be able to recognize it. What does recognition mean? Recognition basically includes all the three processes, namely identification, you need to know what this is; categorization, you know what category this particular object belongs to; and you also need to be able to discriminate a particular stimulus from other kind of stimulus. Say if I show you a mobile phone here, you need to know that it is a mobile phone, you should identify it, you need to know that it is a particular kind of a communication device, and you need to distinguish it from, let us say, if there is a tiffin box next to me. All of these processes combine together to form a recognition, and they basically rely, if to solve this particular problem of recognition, one needs to principally rely on the encoding of spatial information which is derived through perceptual experience. So you need to know what color or shape, those kind of things, spatial frequencies, those different kinds of things, and how do you get those information? You get those information from perceptual experience. You're processing that information using your eyes, and maybe if you're holding it, using your tactile senses. Recognition can only be successful if a mental representation can be matched with the current contents of the perceptual experience. Suppose I have a novel object in my hand. You've never seen something like that, you have no name for it, whether you will be able to recognize it or not. You do not have a matching representation in your head, so you will not really be able to recognize this novel object. So recognition is only possible if you already have some perceptual experience of whatever is outside. Obviously, we'll talk about points when, and talk about how people deal with novel objects at a later point in time. But for now, if you really need to recognize something, you need to have had some experience with it earlier. Now, one of the requirements of this process is that this should be flexible. If you found a mental representation of a visual stimulus, your mental representation should be slightly flexible. I'll tell you why flexible. A flexible mental representation of these objects and scenes must be insensitive to variations in illumination, variations in viewing conditions, and so many other factors. Say for example, I'm standing at a particular point here, there are few lights falling on me. If I kind of move to one step left, or if I kind of move to one step right, the amount of light and the angles of the light falling on me really change. Do you start seeing me differently? I don't think so, isn't it? So you have a mental representation of me right here, which is invariant to the changes in the light. If I kind of start facing on the right side, or I start facing on the left side, then also my perception which you have will not really change. So you have a representation that is stable enough and that is immune to these kind of changes which are happening. Now this is slightly a sophisticated problem, if you really give it enough thought. So this is something which has intrigued people who've been studying perception and investigating perception for a long time now. People have thought of various ways how to solve this. People have thought of various ways how the brain solves it, how the mind really solves it. We'll discuss some of this now. So the thing which I was talking about, these examples, you have a canonical representation, which is a typical representation, the representation of things which you normally see. So for example, this is the posture of the monkey that you already see. You don't really see monkeys or any other animals directly from, from the top, isn't it? You see them from the side, you might see them from the front, maybe from the behind. Generally, because we are not flying beings, for a bird, maybe the one which is non-canonical to us is the more canonical representation, isn't it? Look at the bicycle here. Again, they had two different representations here. One is the typical part, one is the non-typical part, but we know in both the cases that these are bicycles. How do we know that? We have representations, or the mental representation of the bicycle that we have helps us understand that the figure on the right is also a bicycle and the figure on the left is a bicycle anyways. More examples, you can see that there are these figures here, and the representations are kind of changing. The light and the kind of image they are forming on our retina is kind of changing, but we still have a good sense of what each of these objects are. So this is basically the problem of representation that I am actually referring to. Again, you can see the cup, we have different shapes and sizes, we kind of still have the notion that this is a cup. Why are we able to do that? Now, such kind of flexibility, the kind of flexibility we just saw, can be theoretically achieved either by transformation of the representation to match the contents of perceptual encoding. So what do I mean by this? I say that you might have a particular prototype of what an object looks like, and any variations you encounter in the external world, say for example you have a particular shape like this one here, or let us say you have a representation which matches one aspect of the cycle. Maybe the one to the left is what you already have in your head, but what you're seeing outside is the one to the right. How do you do it? So what you might be doing is you might be adjusting this incoming stimulus information to match what you already have. So you're matching this information on the cycle on the right side to the one which you have already in your head, which is the one on the left side. And you're kind of rotating it in some sense, you're transforming it in some sense so that it matches. If this will match, the recognition will be successful. If this does not match, the recognition will be not successful. So this is what we are talking of. The other way this could happen is that the transformation of perceptual encoding can be done in some way to match this representation. Okay, so the first part was basically you're transforming the perceptual encoding. The second part actually, which I said earlier, was the transformation of the representation to match the contents of the perceptual encoding. So either you can change the representation that you have in your head. Now we go back to the same example. We have two representations possible. One is the left one is in your head, the right one is outside. There are only two ways this can happen. Either you change the one in your head to match what is outside, or you change what is incoming from outside to match what is already present. Only two ways this could actually match. You change the right one to match the left one, or you change the left one to match the right one, irrespective of what is inside and what is outside. Okay, so this is what this problem, and this is what needs to be done in order to really have a stable representation. Now, which of the two transformation is more prominent in human recognition, one might ask. One might ask, what are we actually doing? There are two ways, understood, but what are we actually doing? Are we transforming the representations in the head, or are we transforming the perceptual encoding to already match a stable representation in the head? Two things are possible. Let us see what can be done. Now, empirical philosophers like John Locke, you might have heard of him in the history lectures. John Locke basically tried to solve the problem of representation by proposing that we have perceptions composing of simple ideas like something is yellow, it is hot, it is sweet, or complex ideas, which is a combination of something that is both yellow, hot, and sweet. This kind of way basically can lead us to assume that all knowledge is based on experience, and complex entities or objects are essentially combination of qualities derived through experience. So you might have a sense of something that is yellow, you might have a sense of something that is hot, you might have a sense of something that is sweet, and say for example something that is hot and yellow and sweet at the same time, you might just combine these different qualities in your head. Another possible way is basically offered by David Marr. David Marr has been working, has basically given a particular theory of perception. We'll talk about this theory of perception in more detail in a later lecture, but for now I can just tell you that in David Marr's view, the final 3D view or 3D representation of an object. Now, what Marr said is that because the retina is two-dimensional, whatever information that we are actually getting from the outside world is basically mapped on a two-dimensional plane. But we know that the world is not two-dimensional, it is three-dimensional. So some kind of transformation must be done on this two-dimensional information to get the sense of three dimensions, isn't it? People are not really flat as posters, isn't it? People have all the three dimensions, but the image that is formed on the retina is only two-dimensional. So some transformation might be needed there. So David Marr actually came up with a solution. He said that that what we actually get is something which is called a 2.5 dimensional sketch that specifies over the two-dimensional information that you get, informations about orientation and depth. So that is why it adds 0.5D. Two-dimensional information you already get, you add depth and orientation, you get a 2.5 dimensional information, and then that 0.5 part is the variant part, that is the processing that happens on this 2.5D thing to actually overall give you a three-dimensional representation. So I'm just repeating this. So in Marr's view, the final 3D representation of a particular object is basically a product of what is called a 2.5 dimensional sketch that only specified depth distances and orientation changes which are directly visible to any observer. You can take this example, say for example, you are going in a train, you saw a particular cow that is grazing in the field and the train is moving in a particular way. As in when you're going further from the cow, you're finding that the cow is getting smaller, but you still know that it is a cow, isn't it? As in when you're getting closer to the cow is getting bigger. So you're using that information as well. So David Marr actually, and we'll discuss this in much more detail when you're actually talking about David Marr in one of the coming lectures, but this is one of the solutions to this mental representation problem that David Marr had offered. So the 2.5D sketch is formed from a combination of even more basic depth, orientation, whatever two-dimensional information you're getting, plus you add visual cues such as the one which I was mentioning, that is called motion parallax, kinetic depth cues. If something is coming closer, something is getting bigger, it is larger, those kind of things. If something is moving intermittently, then it is moving. If something is blinking, you might think that it is moving. Something like, say for example, blinking lights appear to be moving, which is basically the phenomenon that is used in LED lights, isn't it? So eventually this 2.5D sketch is using these different kinds of sources of information to form what is called a complete three-dimensional representation of an object. Okay, so this is one solution which David Marr has offered. Now there could be these two kinds of phase. So how do we really adjust? How do we really come up with something more conclusive to say about representation? If we begin with the assumption that the content of the representation is determined by the quality of sensory experience and that perception is contained to lie within certain invariant bounds, say for example, you cannot perceive anything that is not being communicated through your senses, isn't it? So those sensory experiences can give you degrees of freedom within which your entire perceptual phenomena will take place. That is what it is saying. Then these boundaries may be reflected by the properties of the representation and consequently affect your recognition performance. Say for example, if your sensory experience gives you only particular levels of information, that particular levels of information gained by sensory experience is also the limits of how much you can transform your mental representation. Okay. Moving slightly further, there could be two things happening with this here. If no processing of sensory experiences is occurring, you're not really transforming the sensory experience, that is staying as it is, then what is happening is the representation is tied down to these sensory properties of the retinal image or optical array, again a concept which is given by Gibson, we'll talk about that at some point, that brought about the representation. So whatever information this light passing through your retina to your lateral geniculate nucleus to the occipital areas is coming, that is what your transformation or that is what your mental representation can actually vary up to. Or there is another possibility. The other possibility is that perception may be an analytical process, okay, wherein we have basically symbolic descriptions of what we are actually seeing of, and these symbolic descriptions are actually adjusting to whatever the information is coming from outside. This ability to generalize or to overcome variations in appearance, as I said, if I move to the left or if I move to the right or if I start facing the right or the left, this invariation in appearance during identification and recognition then depends on the extent of processing that occurs during perception and the kind of information extracted. So while you are just interacting with the stimulus for the first time, you might be getting out information in terms of whether the object is farther or closer, or whatever the texture of the object is, those kind of things. There is also a possibility that during recognition, a stored representation is adjusted to form a match with the current stimulus. So what you're doing is you're changing the stimulus in some sense, you're changing the mental representation in some sense to match the incoming sensory information. I'll tell you how that happens. Say for example, this figure here, we come back to that example, you have a representation which is to the left, and you have the incoming stimulus which is to the right. This is the extent of information that your visual system is getting you. What will you do to match this? You can basically take this representation of the cycle which you have in your head, the one on the left, and you'll kind of try and rotate it mentally, and there are a lot of experiments that have shown that people do actually rotate representations of objects. So you rotate it and you kind of get a view which is matching the view that is being presented outside. And this matching, this transformation on this mental representation will help you match these two representations and achieve successful recognition. There are again these two things, these two possibilities there. So what can be a possible solution? How do we adjust these two variable views? A possible solution could be that neither our retinal images always form the basis of the mental representation. So maybe our mental representations are not entirely bound by these retinal images, nor perception is always analytical. So maybe the perception is not always analytical. Maybe it is also bound in some sense by the incoming sensory information. So then there is a possibility of what is called a middle path. What is the middle path? The middle path is that mental encoding need not to be elaborated to the extent that the true nature of 3D objects are faithfully represented. So it does not need to give you all the details about the object. That should not really be stored, because then it will be slightly inflexible. And that the limitations of perception may be reflected in the nature of spatial encoding. So even your mental representation cannot be completely independent of whatever your sensory experience is. So this will be the middle path. So you don't really from the sensory experience part over specify, and from the mental representation part you cannot go independent of what the sensory experience. So you kind of make an adjustment or a compromise between the two levels. That was about representation, and now you'll basically see the kind of discussion we have had today is going to be the base of many theories of object recognition, many theories of how visual perception takes place, and then we will actually talk about this question in much more detail. I talk to you about this particular question so that it kind of primes you to what is going to come next. This should basically be the baseline in order to understand theories of perception like the ones given by Gibson and David Marr and the Gestalt psychologists, and also to understand theories of object recognition like the template matching theory and the recognition by components model, which all we will be talking about in later lectures. So to summarize today's debate, we talked about what the notion of representation is in cognition and in basically perception in more specific sense. We talked about how these representations can be built, whether they are built using sensory processes or whether they are built through analytical processes where our brain is working on those sensory inputs and it is trying and transforming them. We discussed basically that either of the approaches, an extreme, of either of the two processes might not be the best way out, and so a compromise might be there, and there should be a middle path wherein you kind of underspecify the sensory experience part, and you kind of restrict the sense of how analytical the perceptual process will be with respect to whatever visual input you're getting in. We'll talk about this in much more detail in the coming lectures. This was all about representation in perception. Thank you.